Thanks so much for being here today. I wanted to start. We know climate change impacts everyone, but there are populations who are more at risk because of both, their biological susceptibility and because there are systems in place that create inequities. We usually list children, older adults, pregnant women, low-income communities, and communities of color, but I actually don't hear disabled people as part of this conversation too often. Can you start off our conversation by letting our listeners know some of the ways climate change is impacting disabled people and what the conversation about climate change is among the disabled community? Adriane, why don't we start with you?
Thanks, Rebecca. I would say that climate justice is disability justice, and disability justice is climate justice, first and foremost. People with disabilities comprise about 26% of the population. So that's 1 in 4 Americans. So any community work, any time that we're doing any kind of climate change work, it really does need to have that disability perspective woven in from the beginning. First and foremost, people with disabilities are part of every community everywhere.
Yeah, and Krystal.
Yeah, I would say that everyone with a disability is, first and foremost, everyone with a disability is unique, and even people with the same disability will react to certain natural disasters or climate change impacts differently. But we are especially vulnerable in, for example, the way that disaster response is done, the way that early warning systems are implemented. I see a lot of these like national weather Twitter accounts posting things saying like, a fire warning or like it's super dry out, but they don't, and they include an image, but they don't include alt text. So they're completely ignoring a whole population that requires this to be able to communicate. Also, just even like simple things like a fire alarm in a building, these are really, really loud. And if you have noise sensitivity, you're going to start to like freak out first or panic first because you need to like calm yourself and kind of get used to the noise and figure out what you need to do next. But it's very confusing for someone who has like these auditory sensitivities, which I am also a part of. And then, like I said, disaster response. Shelters don't typically have like medical supplies that people might need if they have a chronic illness. So the list goes on. I don't know. I could talk for hours about that.
I think that really starts to help people understand, that all of the things that we should be considering as we have these discussions. And that's really what we want to get at today is, we are going to talk a lot about the impacts, but we'll get to solutions as our audience knows. But I think, Krystal, just to pick up from there, you and I first connected after I read your piece for Environmental Health News through the Agents of Change and Environmental Justice Fellowship. And you wrote about your own experiences as a disabled researcher focusing on air pollution and wildfires. The whole piece is brilliant and everyone should read it. I think you'll find the link in the chat. But one line in particular really stuck with me. And you write, while the fires themselves don't discriminate, there are systems in place that do. And I just was wondering if you could expand on that.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, a fire or a hurricane, these are natural processes. They are getting more frequent because of climate change, but they're just doing their thing. They're just doing what Earth lets them do. But where and when they happen and the way that we respond to them is very much based on societal norms and societal actions. And so, for example, climate change disproportionately affects low-income communities, communities of color. That is because we have not only kind of pushed these communities into these spaces that are especially vulnerable, but we also don't give them the resources to be able to respond. And the same thing with people with disabilities. They tend to be lower income just because there's a lot of ableism that doesn't allow us to accumulate wealth. And people of color tend to be disproportionately disabled because of the systemic racism that pushes them into places that are not great for their health. So yeah, I think overall it's not the fire itself, it's not the hurricane itself, it's not the earthquake itself, it's what has led up these people to be in the path of this destruction and how we respond to helping them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think where that's there's been some research and a lot of discussion around redlining, for example, as a system that is in place that creates inequities in access to housing and has real implications for where heat that there's been redlining in it, that neighborhoods that are poorer and and more Black and brown people live there because of the systems in place that deny them housing, that it's actually also 12 degrees hotter on any given day, because of the way that our neighborhoods are structured. And so I encourage folks to read about that. It's just one example that's been in the news a lot recently, as we're seeing the ways that society intersects with climate change, to create these and to exacerbate existing inequities and create new ones. So I think, I like I said, I do encourage people to check out that article, because I think you get it. You really do shed light on the systems in place that exacerbate these inequities. So Adriane, did you want to add on?
Yeah, thanks. This is Adriane. I would expand upon the disparities in communication that Krystal was talking about. One of the things that we're doing right now through our Prepared for All initiative on whole community inclusive emergency planning is teaching public health planners and emergency managers how to communicate. It sounds simple, but it's really not, because there's no required training on how to make sure communities get same time information, no matter how they communicate. So we call this principle state, same time access to everyone. And that's baked into our Prepared for All training, and just so critical for all the reasons that Krystal just mentioned. But we go through more specific examples and really make it a safe space for emergency managers, public health planners to come and learn, where they maybe have not had that experience before, to fill in their gaps so that they're better prepared for the next time, because we know with climate change there will be a next time, and we want them to be able to communicate with everybody in the community, get those critical messages out at the same time to everybody. This also brings to mind a situation. I was in South Carolina a couple years back with a rapid flood, and there were a couple women who literally didn't get the evacuation order and drowned to death in their car because they were caught in a flash flood. So these situations happen, and what we can do is be prepared and take time in blue sky steady state to get trained up on what accessible communication would look like, so that everybody in the community, including people with disabilities, gets the information they need.
We're only at the beginning of our conversation, and you've both given such incredible tangible examples already, I think, and so it's already feeling like a lot. Maybe these concepts are new to people and they didn't realize the scope of the issue. They didn't realize how much the gaps that we need to fill. I hear similar conversations when we're talking about building anti-racist policies, that people are feeling it's so much, and to folks who are coming to these topics for the first time and who can be overwhelmed by the amount that there is to do and we must do. What is your advice to people who may be coming to this topic for the first time and are feeling and maybe feeling overwhelmed by what needs to be done? Adriane, if you want to pick it up.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rebecca. So this is Adriane. I would say part of it is to really be humble and admit what you don't know. Sounds simple, but actually a lot of folks will kind of have a little bit of a hero complex and think, well, no, I've been trained. I can't stop and admit I don't know something. So first of all, admit what you don't know. Disability inclusion training is not done systematically for emergency responders, for public health planners. So kind of getting over that, admitting it, and then seeking out information. It's really important. One of the ways that we have really crafted a safe space, so to speak, to come and have those discussions in a real lifetime problem solving mode is through monthly town hall forums that we host through our Prepared for All initiative. And that's a very lively discussion, as you might imagine, where folks come and bring issues and say like, wow, this is just an issue. How do I move forward with this? So a quick example couple months back, we had our partner from Gallaudet University say, I'm not able to get people with disabilities vaccine appointments. They're not accessible and they're not, listening. So how do I do this? So then we were able to connect and encourage them to like keep going, keep working with your regional disability integration specialist. And then fast forward 2 months later, they had a dedicated day at the regional Greenbelt mass vaccination site that was completely accessible. As people came in, they were able to get matched up with really an aid that would give them whatever they needed in terms of communication supports throughout this experience. So it was, fully accessible. So that's just like one example of how we try to like bring the town hall space to emergency folks and planner folks to really make it safe for them to admit what they don't know, but then quickly get up to speed, identify the gaps, and then address them, not just say, oh, I don't know, or I don't see people with disabilities. That's another thing I hear a lot. We don't really see people with disabilities. Well, turns out they're in the community. You just don't see them because you're not serving them. So getting over that, recognizing that awareness and then seeking out training is what we try to do through that safe space of a town hall.
Yeah, I think admitting what you don't know too is so, it can be a big step forward. I think we've almost, stigmatized, like not, admitting you don't know. It's like, how did you not know that, and I think we do some advocacy training for, through our ambassadors program. And what we say all the time is, especially, this is just another one example, right? When you're with policymakers, if they ask you a question and you don't know, the best thing you can do is say you don't know, because first, you're not lying, but also it's a great excuse to follow up. And I think admitting you don't know, it's a great place to build connection, actually, by saying you don't know and being open to learn and listen. So I think that's probably a universal lesson. And that's, I think, really important. And honestly, one of the reasons we're having this conversation is because I didn't know a lot. I first started learning about including folks with disabilities as part of, climate change planning in general, when APHA had American Public Health Association had their year of climate change and health in 2017. That was where I started to see this part of the conversation really enter that environmental health space. Because even in public health, I feel like we can sometimes silo, and sort of breaking those silos can help also some of this planning work. And so I'm really grateful to be having this conversation, because I didn't know. There's still a lot I don't know, and grateful for you bringing your knowledge forward in this forum. So Krystal, you want to pick it up? What about folks who are maybe feeling overwhelmed with the amount that there is to do in this space? What would you say to them?
First, it's okay to be overwhelmed. Even as someone with a disability, I did come into my disability a little later in life, a few years ago, and that transition for me was overwhelming, to learn about this community that I never thought of until I was a part of it. One of the things that I did personally was go straight to Twitter. There are a lot of amazing disability activists. One of the links in my article is from Alice Wong, who has written about like how she's impacted by fires with her disability, and how it's also affecting other people in this scenario. It was the large fire in the Bay Area a few years ago. So yeah, I would go social media. It has its cons, but I think it also has a great community in there. I would seek out disability activists that are marginalized in multiple ways. I believe that if you can hear the voices of those who are most marginalized or most vulnerable to these scenarios, you can really start to figure out ways to help everyone. And then also, I would just caution to always come into a space and listen and try to, it's okay if you have preconceived notions. We've been grown up in an ableist society, so everyone has their biases, but always try and challenge them when you're in a space. Listen, be like, why am I thinking this? Is this really true? And then ask questions. Some people won't be willing to answer questions because it's personal, but it doesn't hurt to ask, and maybe they can direct you to someone who is willing to open up that way. So yeah, Twitter and social media, ask lots of questions and listen.
It's another thing that's really sticks with me is it's okay to, like, same thing as admitting that you don't know is maybe admitting, yes, I did have a preconceived notion about this. I did think this way. And, challenging yourself, but also challenging, if you're in a room full of abled people and there are preconceived notions that you've then learned aren't, I think one of the, a big challenge to people is to in a room where everybody is similar and no one can stand up for the minority opinion, but there's an inequity that's being perpetuated in that space, being someone who can speak up in that space, because you'd be maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but when there isn't someone in the room who's different, what can be said in those spaces, I think, can be very harmful in perpetuating those preconceived notions in many different ways. So I appreciate that advice as well. We are getting some audience questions, so for the listeners, make sure you're typing in your questions. But Lisa asked, she's wondering, are disability groups mobilizing to address environmental issues? And do you know of any disability groups or organizations that are more active in environmental work? Either one of you to start.
Yeah, so this is Adriane. I'll kick us off.
Yeah.
I think that this is actually a huge opportunity for the disability community writ large to really pay attention to in a deeper way. It's something that I've observed at different organizations, that it is slowly but surely becoming part of the strategy for what it means to do health or public health programming, and kind of, like you said, Rebecca, starting to break down those silos, because people do have preconceived notions of what health programming is or what public health programming is for people with disabilities. But like I said at the beginning, I really believe that, like, climate justice is disability justice, disability justice is climate justice. So you can't really have a well-rounded set of programs not paying attention to climate change. That said, the lens that AUCD and the National Center on Disability and Public Health that I oversee really looks at this through is emergency preparedness, and really thinking about some of the lessons that we learned after Hurricane Maria. We, speaking about listening, we did interviews with our territorial leaders there to say, like, how can we learn from this so that we don't repeat these same mistakes? So we had those in-depth interviews, and the themes that bubbled up were just really powerful around training, really making sure that we identified those needs and addressed those gaps. And so I'm happy and proud that we've done that with the Prepared for All initiative, but also around partnerships and making sure that disability organizations are at the table as critical stakeholders. So I would say the stakeholder piece and the partnership piece around climate justice is huge, and really just, like, leaning into those relationships over time, because that's really what's going to make for sustainable change.
Yeah, and Krystal.
Yeah, I love that, the bringing disability organizations to the table. I feel like this is a community that's been fighting so many battles because we've been virtually ignored for so long in society. And so it ends up coming to decisions of, like, should we focus on the environment in, like, what's it called? In like hospitals, like the ableism in like medical settings? Should we focus on SSI or SSDI and the fact that that's not enough to live on? But I do see that there are climate conversations starting to happen gradually, and I think that there are organizations forming, and I really love that. I'm kind of blanking on a few names, but there are also activists. One activist that I follow on Twitter is her name is Daphne Frees. She's a disabled climate activist, and she does a lot of speaking and tying in communities of color and disabled communities. And so, yeah, I don't know. That's all I can say about that.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think it gives people a great starting point. And I have another question actually from Kabisha, who asks about mental health and disaster. So, especially for people who experience severe forms of distress. So, and I would just put that in the context of climate change, sort of this intersection of mental health people with disabilities and a changing climate, or, in your specific context of emergency preparedness or disaster planning, how do you see those topics intersecting? And I know Jess will probably put in the chat our mental health and our changing climate report that we did with the American Psychological Association for folks who do want to dig in a little bit more on the mental health impacts of climate change and what they can do to build individual and community resiliency. But how would you sort of frame that mental health, climate change, and the disabled community? Krystal, why don't you answer first?
Yeah, I mean, I don't feel necessarily super qualified to answer this question, but I will say that mental health, mental illness is a part of the disability community. Not everyone who is mentally ill or struggling with mental health will identify as disabled, but we share a lot of the same concerns and a lot of the same battles. And then also people with disabilities, if they're not mental illnesses, also struggle a lot with mental health. And that is put, and our mental health is put, or there's extra strain on our mental health when we're going through situations where we're in danger and it sounds like no one around us is really caring. So yeah, I don't want to talk too much because I don't feel qualified, but I will say that I think it's important, and I think it's something that we really need to start focusing on. And it's definitely a gap in a lot of research surrounding both climate change in general, but climate change as it affects marginalized communities.
Yeah, and Adriane.
Yeah, this is Adriane. Mental health needs were one of the key themes that we identified in those in-depth interviews that I mentioned a few moments ago with our territorial leaders after Maria. And we highlight in our white paper around that we need to think about the whole person, that people with disabilities aren't just one diagnosis or one condition, that there are multiple conditions or co-occurring conditions that often occur with different types of disabilities, as well as picking up on something that you just said, Krystal, that's important for everybody in the community in terms of building out resilience, really thinking about how you might feel if you put yourself in the shoes of someone with a disability, if you were feeling completely ignored, yet in this really dire emergency situation. What would that feel like? What strain would that put on you, even if you had not already yet had a mental health issue that had manifested itself? That strain, it's natural that there would be some kind of a mental health condition perhaps that would occur with that. So the advice that our territorial leaders really came up with was to make sure that we're framing out that mental health impacts everyone and impacts all of us, and that's not something that the disability community has the corner on the market for, that it's mental health is really an important component of climate justice.
Yeah, definitely. In the report, really it does highlight several of the topics that you have brought up, and I think it does talk about children are particularly vulnerable, because if children, especially young children, are really relying on a caregiver. And if something happens to their caregiver, it can have long lasting impacts on children's mental health. And I think, there's a concept that's brought up in the report called solastalgia, which is a loss of place. So if there's, climate change is changing our landscape, and we're losing places. And if that place is your home, that can be, or a place of cultural value to you, it can be devastating. And there are, people who experience PTSD, symptoms similar to PTSD after disaster events, but it's also the ongoing worry. And I mean, Krystal, researchers who study climate change also it's a population of concern, because people, are going down the rabbit hole in these, learning about bad things that are going to happen and that we're not doing anything about them. But interestingly, that taking action and becoming part of the solution and being, active in the climate movement can mitigate some of that, that overwhelming, even though it's okay to be overwhelmed sometimes, feeling, because you're being part of the solution. And so let's pick up on that solutions. We've uncovered a lot of issues and really, and talked about some of the, concerns and really new issues to consider if people aren't already considering them. But let's talk about solutions. How can people plug in? How can they, raise, disability rights in the context of climate change? Where can they plug in as individuals, as organizations? What's your advice for people who now are learning about this and say, okay, I want disability, people with disabilities to be a bigger part of the conversation in the climate and disaster planning world? Where do I start? What do I do? What are the needs out there? How can people plug in? So Adriane, why don't you start?
Thanks, Rebecca. This is Adriane. I would say it's really important to ask yourself a simple question. Is what I'm doing for all? Is what I'm doing for all? And if you can start with that question and then reflect on, are you making sure that the communication is really shared at the same time to everyone, that you have thought through the accessibility supports so that no matter how a person communicates, no matter how a person moves about the community, that you are able to serve that individual. The other thing I would say is that the disability community is super diverse, and it's really important to engage in community conversations, to ask people what they need and really collaborate in a true way with people in your community. And you'd be surprised if you ask yourself, is this for all? And then ask people in your community, how can we help? How can we work with you? You'd be surprised at the, first of all, the gratitude for the acknowledgement, you're seeing me, which is good. You're getting the awareness raising, but also you're engaging people as true stakeholders, not an afterthought. That's one thing I really just want to emphasize to the listeners today, is just thinking about including people with disabilities in planning right from the get-go. And then the other piece I would say too is really honor where you're at, but at the same time, strive to be better and look for how you can fill in your gaps. And that takes, some honesty and humility, like we were talking about before.
Yeah, Krystal.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have much to add because that was a great response. I do want to emphasize I want to emphasize both parts of your answer. Is one, the accessibility component. Like I probably won't attend if there's not a Zoom option. If I'm feeling super fatigued and can't get out of bed and drive to wherever, I'm just not going to go. Captions. If you're promoting it on social media, make sure that all the images are accessible to people who are visually impaired or use screen readers. And then the other aspect of that is, definitely just be okay with being corrected, because if you're not a part of the community, and even if you are a part of the community, it's such a diverse community that everyone's going to have a different access need. So be okay with engaging in this conversation and being corrected. If someone's like, you didn't do this and it wasn't accessible to me, it's not anything against you personally. They're just expressing their need. They're expressing how they can be a part of the space that you created. So yeah, that's all I have to add.
Yeah, and then I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on language too. I think it's one of the things that trips people up even in getting started, is like, again, if you don't know, and you don't want to use the wrong term, and you don't want to be, you think that that's going to be received the wrong way, like talk a little bit about language, and how people should be, in this space, like how important is language? Again, I think Krystal, your comment about being okay being corrected, I think is like, that just sort of made me think about that language and what language we use, and your advice for people who want to get into this, want to support this work, what language do they use? So Krystal, if you want to pick it up.
Yeah, again, there's no really correct answer. Some people use what's called identity first language. So a disabled person. Some people use person first language. So a person or people with a disability. It just really depends. There's also a lot of ableist language that we use in our everyday speech. So I'm sorry for saying these things, but like the word stupid, the word idiot, like these aren't things that, like, this is very stigmatizing to the people with developmental disabilities, people with mental illness disabilities. So just, it's okay to slip up, and I've definitely slipped up myself. But when someone says this is offensive, instead of, getting defensive and being like, I didn't mean it that way, just apologize and say that you're going to learn and that you're going to reflect and that you're going to think about it. And I think that's the best thing that you can do, because no one's going to be right all the time. And no one's going to, be perfect. So I think that the best thing that you can do to welcome the disability community into spaces you create and to be able to have a conversation with us is just being willing to say sorry and being willing to just learn and adjust your habits and behaviors.
Yeah, don't worry. My husband reminds me all the time that I can't be right all the time. So I got that one covered. But Adriane, why don't you pick it up?
Thank you. This is Adriane. Well, Krystal just so nicely shared about, the different ways of identifying disability, either identity first or, disability first. I think the key is to ask the person how he, she, they would like to be identified. Similar to how we ask folks, hey, what are your preferred pronouns? You can also say, hey, how would you like for me to represent your disability? And some folks disclose their disability and some folks also do not. So that might also be another thing you need to really drill down on at an individual level. But then once you need to make the commitment to move to action, not just say, oh, well, but really think about, well, how will I remember to show up differently in future conversations to really be a disability ally and not just ignore what you just learned, but how do you move into action?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate your perspectives on that, because I do know some people just get so caught up in the language that like it almost prevents them from getting started and entering the space. And so just appreciate your perspectives there. And Adriane, you and I first met through work with the Maryland Public Health Association. And so as we're talking about solutions, are there specific things that states can do or even localities? What's your advice for folks who want to engage locally in equitable climate solutions?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. So this is Adriane. I would say locally, it's really important to be familiar with what's going on in your area and get involved with knowing what policies are impacting climate in your area. And then beyond that, know that, there are going to be climate related emergencies. There just are, climate change is happening. And so as part of that movement to taking a positive action, I would encourage everyone to make sure that they are familiar with their community emergency response plan and look for opportunities to integrate a disability perspective into that planning. That would be a way that you could not only help address some of the climate issues, but then also make sure that you have that voice as a critical community stakeholder in other emergency response and preparedness efforts.
Yeah, and Krystal.
Can you repeat? Sorry, I'm a little foggy right now. Can you repeat the question?
The question is about local, how would you get involved in local equitable climate solutions? So I think, when we say, get active, call your legislator, there are at least, things, I do think people still automatically think of their folks in DC and federal policy and what the federal government can do, which is critically important. We should still continue to do that, but there's so much to do. I mean, when you think about something like public transportation, public transportation is a huge climate solution, particularly in, urban and semi-urban areas. I know for rural, that's not necessarily something they can implement in the same way that you can in urban, but make it, that only works if it's accessible, right? And so and is it accessible, and how do we measure that? And so like how can people get involved locally in this space for equitable climate solutions while advocating for people with disabilities?
Yeah, I mean, that's something I struggle with myself. So I know some issues in like LA's metro, like the elevators don't work and such, but like there's a barrier to knowing who to talk to about this. And so I just really start small. I start in my school, my university. I've tried to, engage with the administrators and be like, we don't have a disability specialist right now. Maybe we should hire one. And eventually we did. And so I think starting conversations with the people that specifically the people that that could create change and have that like power to do so. So yeah, I totally understand the barrier. I think that local policy is very intimidating. And so if you are intimidated like I am, I would just start at your local school system, universities, your job. And I think that creates just as much change as anything else. So
Great. And then I think that sort of to build on that, what are some ways to have a whole community perspective in planning? I think we've sort of used some terms that get close to that, but then how do we incorporate that whole community perspective when we talk about planning? And I'll also say planning and zoning and master plans, these things that we have to be, aware of that dictate some of these policies may only happen every 10 years, or there might be a 50-year plan or a 30-year plan. So like we have to make sure that voices are represented at the beginning of that. I mean, in public health is one of the voices that's often left out of some of these, planning and zoning policies, which is, how you end up sometimes with neighborhoods next to polluting facilities, because, if my humble opinion is that if public health were a louder voice in that planning process, we wouldn't have, these cumulative impacts in neighborhoods that, back to the systemic change, we were talking about earlier. And so it's important to have those voices really early, because sometimes then those plans are locked in for 10, 20, 50 years. And I think, so how can we do that? What does it look like to have that whole community perspective in planning? And Adriane, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So this is Adriane. I would say that partnerships are key, and going out and being brave, be brave and reach out to folks that you might not necessarily have thought of as allies in the space. So actually in your scenario that you just were mentioning, Rebecca, made me think of some of the work that we were doing as we were preparing the Prepared for All initiative and the online whole community training. Was thinking about regional and local businesses and really asking folks to think about them as partners and be strategic and do that outreach, even if it didn't feel like in your comfort zone, right? You might think like, oh, why am I talking to that business? The reason is for all the reasons you just listed. You want to make sure that you're at the table. So if decisions are made about your community, decisions aren't made about you without you, but you're part of those decisions. So thinking differently about who you consider to be an ally and cultivating that relationship and being brave, reaching out, that's important. Because also to your earlier point, Rebecca, people don't know what they don't know. And there might be there will be, I won't say might, there will be real value that you bring in terms of a climate justice discussion.
Yeah, one of the things I hear a lot in the environmental justice space is if we're not at the table, then we're probably on the menu. So it's what you just said reminded me of that age-old wisdom. Krystal, what's your advice for that whole community perspective in planning?
I mean, I'm not going to say anything that wasn't already said, but just invite people to the table. Look around when you sit at the table, look around and ask yourself who's being represented right there. Usually it's not the people who are most at risk for these climate issues. People in policy spaces tend to have a lot of privilege, a lot of racial privilege, a lot of income privilege. And so see who's missing and then actively try and seek out those types of people so that they have a voice in the conversation. Because a lot of times there's this like big activation barrier that you need to come over on both sides. The people who are most marginalized don't feel like they're going to be heard, so they don't engage. And the people who are not a part of those communities have the power, but they don't know how to help these communities because they don't have that life experience. So yeah, I would say just, look around and ask yourself who's missing, go find them, and then when you do eventually find them, actually listen. Like, don't, I think we said earlier in this talk, like, don't come in with that savior complex. You're not saving these communities, you're giving them the tools that they need to help themselves.
Yeah, definitely. And Brianna's asking, are there specific places that are doing a really good job with emergency response planning for the disability community, places we can look to as models? Do you have some examples? Either one of you?
Yeah, this is Adriane. I have a couple that I would hold up. The Florida Department of Health actually has shared some really nice examples with us recently with making sure that shelters are accessible, and they have put together sensory kits for folks that do have to utilize a shelter in an emergency situation. So it has things like noise canceling headphones, earplugs, like fidget, things for your hands. Folks need those to calm down and be in a space. And so these kits were given to all of the sites across Florida. And then the other thing that I know that the Florida Department of Health has done in a particularly good way is make sure that the COVID vaccine distribution sites are fully accessible, and they'll assign an accessibility person at the check-in so that as that individual shows up, they have a fully accessible experience. So that's one that pops into my head. There's another group, actually it's a student. I also want to say that, no matter what level you're at, you can make some of these changes happen. So we have a student collaborating with us through the University of Idaho who learned about emergency preparedness, disability inclusion, and said, hey, I want to do more. And so this person is doing a bit of an analysis of where are the levers for emergency management, for policy, what does that look like locally, and how do you get to the table? How do you get that disability voice included? So no matter what level you're at in your day-to-day life, you can make some of these changes happen and really move to positive actions.
Yeah, Krystal.
I don't have any organizations to add because I am not extremely aware of that, but I am very happy to hear about the Florida program that you spoke about. And I do also want to emphasize that, again, what Adriane said is that at any level, you can start doing something that will make a change, even if it's just forming like a club or something at your local school. At least you're having, or you're starting the conversation, and that people can come in and learn. So I think that's great.
Yeah, definitely agreed. So I know we're coming close to the end. So I just have one final question to wrap us up and send us on our way. We often hear that you won't truly understand someone else until you walk a mile in their shoes, but we're all different and all trying to build equity into climate solutions. So what's your advice for the best way people can show empathy as they perhaps work with folks, all different folks in the space? What's the best way people can show empathy and then also put action to that feeling? Krystal, why don't we start with you?
I would say that regardless of the disability that someone has, we're still people. We're just like you. We still have the same likes and dislikes that you might have. We may like the same foods that you like, just treat us like another person, and we just might be another person who needs to navigate the world a little differently. So I think it's been said many times during this conversation, but always listen to when we're voicing our needs, be respectful, but also don't think of us like this like super special community that like, oh no, we can't, like, they're so fragile, we can't touch them, because that's just, we're not children. And I think that that's a thing that happens a lot in the disability space, is that it's like we're treated as children that have no like willpower or free will. And so just again, we're people. We just want to be safe, we just want to be heard, we just want to have the same privileges that many people get in society that we don't have. So yeah.
Yeah, and Adriane.
Yeah, this is Adriane. I would also add that we need to have real respect for the expertise that people with disabilities bring to various planning tables through their lived experience. The other thing that this conversation brings to mind to me is that we all need to have a commitment to learn and implement what we learn as we go. One way to do that, I would, again, plug the Prepared for All initiative and our whole community inclusive emergency planning. I think taking that would really be a good first step for folks that maybe this is new to. And one of the other calls to action that I would love to leave you all with is for you all at a local level to form a Prepared for All action team. It could be a club at your school, or it could be something that you do organization-wide or in your region, but really thinking about how can you make sure that you're giving the same time access to everyone from a communications perspective and really be inclusive and for all.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Krystal and Adriane, for joining us as our guests. We are grateful for the words that you shared today and for the ongoing work that you're doing. We're at the end of our time already here today, but I know you have inspired our listeners to act on climate to improve our health and our families' health. Thank you again so much for the wisdom that you shared today. For all our listeners, please click on the link to the survey when this webcast ends to provide your feedback. If you're watching this on YouTube, check out the description below to let us know what you think. Engage with us online using the hashtag Let's Talk Climate, and be sure to subscribe and follow us for the latest thought leadership, resources, and episodes on climate action and advocacy. Join us next week on Thursday, June 24th for the Let's Talk Climate episode, Energy Justice is Loving Our Neighbor, with our Blessed Tomorrow director and Reverend Michael Malcolm, founder and executive director of the People's Justice Council. Our next Climate for Health episode will be on July 15th, co-hosted with the National Environmental Health Association. Sign up for the Climate for Health newsletter so you don't miss a beat. From all of us at ecoAmerica and Climate for Health, thank you. Please join me in caring for our climate in order to care for our health. Stay well, stay safe, and see you next week.